More and more these days, it feels like skill trees are cropping up in all sorts of games. You've seen them in Rocksteady's Arkham games, the Avengers games from Square Enix, and Monolith Studios' Shadow of Mordor games. The recent Spider-Man games have skill trees. The Far Cry games have skill trees. Remember Resident Evil 6? Yeah, that had some bizarre interpretation of skill trees too. Even Doom Eternal had those diet skill trees mixed in with all of its other wacky systems like crystals and shards and demon fart collectors or whatever the hell is going on in that game. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that this system whereby a player upgrades a character's skills along predefined linear or branching paths is very popular. Skill trees, in theory, allow for granular control over a character, and that level of control, in turn, provides the player with the ability to play through the game in their quote-unquote own way. But what I'd like to argue today is that most skill trees in AAA action games don't actually matter. On top of that, sometimes, players shouldn't play their own way. Sometimes what's best is that they play exactly the way the designers intend them to play. And in order to argue the above points, I'd like to use an example of a game that actually does skill trees properly, but more on that in a moment. And before we jump in, why don't you spend some of your hard-earned video points on the like button smash skill branch, and then hop on over to the subscribe forever skill tree to get your character into fighting shape. All good? Alright, let's dive in. It's not that the skill trees in Arkham Knight or Far Cry 17 or whatever they're on. What are they on now? I don't know. Far Cry, whatever number they're on now. What is it? Far Cry 8? Far Cry 9? Whatever it is. It's not that they don't do anything. They definitely allow for some level of customization, but what they wind up doing in actuality isn't really anything to write home about. Here's some of the upgrade outcomes you can expect in a standard Batman simulator and other games of its ilk. You can have a boost in critical hit probabilities, strengthen armor, gain new combat skills, increase targeting capability, yada yada yada. But do these kind of outcomes actually give the player the opportunity to shape their character? Most of the time, these outcomes do more to create an illusion of freedom than actually facilitating true player choice. In fact, it's not really freedom those kinds of systems are even after, but something more akin to character growth. In Arkham Knight, Batman becomes more powerful and capable as the player makes their way through the game, but what does that growth actually yield? Well, not really a whole hell of a lot, I'm afraid to say. Let's focus on strengthened armor for a moment. What does this allow the player to actually do? Well, for starters, they can get punched in the face more, which I guess is a good thing.
Because they belong to me.
They can perhaps take more risk in the way they approach stealth or combat, but ultimately, increased health or armor flattens the difficulty curve, allowing the player to make it through scenarios that require larger reserves of hit points. Of course, a designer that wants to keep players engaged won't let this difficulty curve stay flat for long. They'll introduce new enemy types or harder puzzles or what have you, and they'll put the player back on their toes. Giving the player the opportunity to spend experience or skill points toward increasing their HP or armor is great, in games that provide the player the opportunity to choose to be a brawler, as opposed to other potential roles like sneaker, hacker, and so forth. But the operative word there is choice.
He chose poorly.
And what choice is the player able to make in Arkham Knight after they've upgraded their armor? Regardless of what they decide, there are still sections of the game that are stealth forward, and there are those that are combat forward. These scenarios are delineated by the game's design, not the player's choice. So why let the player choose to upgrade their armor in the first place? Why not just grant them the upgrade automatically at either a predetermined point in the story or when some XP threshold is reached? Let's put aside the not one, but two logical leaps that allow for 1. A human being to increase their skills and abilities to such ludicrous extent in a single evening, and 2. Batman needing some newfangled skills to fight crooks. This is the Batman we're talking about. Why is this system here in the first place?
I'm Batman.
Progression is a huge factor in keeping the player engaged in an interactive experience. This is as much a design decision as it is a financial one. Skill trees are a sort of back-of-the-box feature that communicate to the player that there's more game here or more interactivity. And if one AAA game with skill trees sells a bajillion copies, some executive somewhere might look at that and say, we have to have skill trees in our game too. Skill trees are also a relatively cheap way to keep players engaged. Some abilities will require a new animation or special effect here or there, but what work is required for boosting stats? Turning a knob? That's easy stuff. It's also an easy way to add, and I hate to say this, content. Hey, check out this cool skill tree you can explore while you play through the game. Maybe if you don't pay attention to the fact that a lot of these moves are useless, you'll think you're having fun.
Oh, y'all wanted a twist, eh?
Progression in a game like Prey works differently.
Differently.
It works the way progression should work. By upgrading Morgan Yu's abilities across 6 different categories, the player is accessing new opportunity, not just growth. Tired of being discovered by robots and then having to bang them into scrap with your wrench? Well, you could quiet the sound of your footsteps by spending along the stealth branch. You could also unlock the mimic branch and roll around the world as a teacup. Naturally, these new abilities lead to all sorts of different gameplay opportunities unrelated to the reason you unlocked them in the first place, which leads me to my next point. Because Prey is a game about choice, skill trees giveth and they also taketh away. This is because in a simulation built around choice, there needs to be consequences for a player's actions. Since Morgan is literally injecting alien DNA right into his eyeballs, 3 of the categories you can spend points on are alien in nature. As the player spends in those categories, a little meter begins to tick up. After a certain threshold is reached, the security systems in the game begin to recognize Morgan not as an intrepid neuroscientist, but rather just another evil alien. That means the player will be fired upon by the auto turrets littered around the world. That's not where the decision-making ends for the player, though. The player, now faced with the new status quo, can decide to boost their stealth abilities in order to avoid the wrath of the security systems, or they can develop their hacking skills to realign the turrets to only focus on the real bad guys. Or they could tune the power of their long-range weapons to zap the turrets from afar. There are many different ways to handle this situation, a situation that unfolded because the player made a choice about how to play the game. This is the trick that devs try to pull on folks when they add a skill tree system to their game. They want to have their cake and eat it too. But you can't just put a system that is by definition about choice and consequence into a game that has no meaningful choices or consequences. At the end of the day, or in the case of Batman, the Knight, Batman doesn't need more hit points. He's freaking Batman. He doesn't need to unlock more moves. He already knows all the moves. He's Batman. This guy's been studying karate for his entire life. If your game is a power fantasy designed to let players pull on the armored boots of a ninja Dracula man, then just let players do that. But if you want them to make more intelligent decisions about how to play the game, you're going to have to present them with real choices to make. Alright, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe. As always, I really appreciate the support. See you next time.